Okay, so this is going to be a quick and dirty video overview of dealing with the consumer tax issue that complements the producer tax issue we covered in class last week or 2 weeks ago. So what we're going to do in going through this video is, number one, we're just going to show how you draw that line and how you read that line. Then we're going to look at a price, starting with the original equilibrium price before tax was imposed, and look at what are the behaviors of consumers and producers at that price. We're going to find that you don't get an equilibrium. You don't get a situation in which the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. Then we're going to go to the new equilibrium price based on the tax and show what the results are. All right. So first of all, let's draw that. Let's draw the adjusted demand curve. But first, we want to make sure that we're clear on, we're dealing with. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. We want to be clear that we're dealing with the demand curve and the supply curve. The supply curve is also the marginal cost curve for the industry. So if we have a given demand curve and we're going to say that there's going to be a $50 tax imposed on consumers, what that means is that consumers are going to be responding to a price using their standard demand curve, right? But then part of that price, $50 of that price, will be removed by the retailer, given to the government, and the remaining amount will be passed on to the producers. So how do we draw that adjusted demand curve? So what we're going to do is just say, okay, we're going to choose 2 points along that demand curve and subtract $50, right? So we're going to start at that 450, subtract 50, and that gives us 400. And then we'll say, okay, at 300, we'll go down to 250. And then we're just going to try and draw a straight line that represents the demand curve adjusted down by $50. Okay, so keep in mind that this new line, again, when you do this on an assessment, you'll be using a straight edge and it'll be much better. But anyway, this adjusted demand curve is only a mechanism by which we will find the new equilibrium quantity. Once we find that equilibrium quantity, that adjusted demand curve goes away. So anyway, so we have that adjusted demand curve. So let's just assert a price. Let's just say, we'll just start with the original market equilibrium price. It's about $230, right? So at that price, how do consumers respond? Well, they just read right off their demand curve at a price of 230. The demand is going to be 75 pounds, okay? But of that $230, $50 is going to be taken away by the retailer and passed on to the government. That leaves $180 going to producers. So producers, following their standard behavior of marginal revenue equals marginal cost, they're going to keep supplying the good up to the point where their marginal costs rise to the price that they receive. So the price that they receive is $180. So that basically means they're going to continue to produce goods up until they produce 60 pounds. So what we have is a discrepancy between the supply and demand. Only 60 pounds of medical marijuana is supplied, but 75 pounds is demanded. So markets are not clearing. There's unmet demand. So we're clear that that price that consumers face and then adjusted to the price actually received by producers is such that you're not going to get supply equaling demand. All right? So let's look at a new price that takes care of that situation. All right, so we still have the same graph. We're going to make it a little bit larger. We're going to go ahead and draw that same adjusted demand curve. So subtracting $50 from 2 separate points. So 300 down to 250. And then we're going to try and carefully draw that line. Again, you will have to draw a very straight line because you'll have a straight edge. You'll be doing it on paper. Anyway, so we now have our adjusted demand curve. Demand curve adjusted down by $50 again. It's not a new demand curve. It's just a point to help us figure out what should be the new equilibrium quantity. All right. So let's choose a new price of, let's see. Well, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, we know more or less that the quantity, the quantity that clears the market, the quantity at which supply will equal demand, is going to be at the point where that adjusted demand curve intersects the supply curve, or that marginal cost curve, right? So we have this quantity, and so we're going to kind of work backwards and say, okay, at that quantity, roughly speaking, consumers are willing to pay $250. So we're kind of backward engineering the demand. We're saying, hey, if there was if we had a quantity of, let's see, this is 65 pounds, what would be the price that would be required to generate 65 pounds? It's about 250, and again, because my lines are not really that straight, this is very crude, but hopefully it gets the idea across. Consumers could hear a price of 250, demand 65, and that would take care of their demand, right? But of course, you still have that issue of $50 is being taken out by the retailers from that $250 price, which leaves producers getting receiving $200 per unit. And if we look at, and if we keep in mind that, again, producers are willing to produce goods up to the point where the marginal cost equals the marginal revenue. In this case, the marginal cost equals the price they actually receive, which is $200. So they just keep producing goods up until the point where the marginal cost equals $200, and lo and behold, it's also 65. So we have a situation where markets are clearing. The demand of 65 pounds of medical marijuana, for which consumers will pay $250 per pound, is equal to the supply of medical marijuana of 65 pounds, which is based on the $200 they receive per unit, which is simply $250 that the consumers pay after $50 has been taken out to be given to the government as a tax. All right, so we have markets clear. Our assertion that the equilibrium quantity in this special situation of a tax occurs where the supply is going to intersect that adjusted demand curve. All right. So what more can we say regarding this result? Well, first of all, because on the previous exercise with the producer tax, what we did is we looked at, hey, what is the consumer surplus, producer surplus, tax, deadweight loss, etc. in this particular situation. So we'll look at the consumer surplus first. Consumer surplus is simply the graphically the area under the demand and above the price paid. So that's this triangle here, and it's important to keep in mind that we are using the actual demand curve and not the adjusted demand curve, because the demand curve itself reflects consumer attitudes, behaviors, etc. That adjusted demand curve does not represent anything about behaviors. It's our mechanism to get to the right quantity. All right. So that is okay. So that is the consumer surplus. Next item is the producer surplus, and again, graphically, what we identify the producer surplus as the area underneath the price received, but above the marginal cost curve. So this area, this blue area, represents the producer surplus. And next we have to identify the tax revenue. So $50 times the quantity of 65. So the area of this rectangle represents the tax revenue. Okay, and that leads us to the last element, which is, let's see, get a new color, the deadweight loss, which in this particular example is the foregone benefits by not being at the normal market equilibrium, which occurs when there is no tax. So roughly speaking, if you compare this picture to the results of the producer tax, the $50 producer tax, the picture is pretty much exactly the same. The numbers might be a little off just because of my, my imprecise lines, but you can take it from me that the result is exactly the same equilibrium quantity, the same price paid by the consumers, same price received by the producers based on the same $50 tax. So what this is basically saying is that it really doesn't matter if you impose the same tax on either the producers or the consumers, the outcome is going to be exactly the same. And that means that if you look at the statement at the end of the guided inquiry exercise, there's a statement that says, essentially saying it's not so much a tax on consumers or a tax on producers, it's more a tax on the transaction. So ultimately speaking, we say it doesn't really matter who pays the tax, because the consumer surplus is going to be the same, the producer surplus is going to be the same, the tax revenue is going to be the same, and the deadweight loss is going to be the same. So all the outcomes are the same, so it should end up being that neither the consumer or producer should care who pays the tax, because it's affecting behaviors all the way around. I would suggest that you go into the second part of the guided inquiry exercise and reproduce these results using a straight edge and being a lot more precise to get ready for the Module 1 assessment. And I think that's pretty much it. This is going to be a lot of practice, but I will say that in the assessment you will probably not see the same exact supply and demand curves, and you will probably not see the same tax. It's going to be roughly the same, but not exactly the same. Okay?